This is Radio Rick Spector for Moviehouse Productions. Susan Couvreur, board member of the Historical Society of Frankford, tells me there's no greater Frankford storyteller than fellow board member Fred Prescott. Fred's 83, and he has lived, but for a short period, his whole life in Frankford. Welcome, Fred, to share with us his Frankford. Fred, we'll start. What are the boundaries of the Frankford neighborhood?
Starting on the east side, you run a southerly course right up next to the railroad. Now, it used to be Trenton Avenue. Well, continue on down alongside the railroad till we hit Frankford Creek. So now you travel up the creek, you keep following the creek till you get to Castor Avenue. Now you follow along Castor Avenue all the way up to the boulevard. You run across the boulevard to the boulevard circle, and Cheltenham Avenue comes in at the circle. Now, you take Cheltenham Avenue all the way back down to our starting point. Now, at one time, the Frankford Arsenal was included in the boundaries of Frankford, but when I-95 came through, it kind of cut us off from the Arsenal.
What type of ethnic groups lived in Frankfurt when you were growing up?
Well, in my mind, Frankfurt was a little different than other parts of the city. For instance, Bridesburg, the biggest ethnic group there were Polish people. But here in Frankfurt, there was pretty much any kind of ethnic group you could think of. There was Irish and English and Scotch, German, Dutch. There was black. The only group that I can say was not really represented in my memory was anybody from the Latino community or maybe Asians. Well, my first home was at 2035 Margaret Street. The Prescott clan was relatively young by Frankfurt standards. My great-great-grandfather and grandmother immigrated into the country in 1880. They were naturalized in 1884. And by 1890, they owned the house, or at least they had the mortgage on 2035 Margaret Street. Now, that sits on the north side of Margaret, almost central to the width of the whole block. So it was 2035 Margaret Street. All right. That's between Dittman Street and Torresdale Avenue.
My heart's all aglow.
Tell us a little bit about your parents and your wife, Ronnie.
Okay. My dad, by the way, was the second Fred in the family. My grandfather was Frederick. My father was Frederick, and I was Frederick. So if somebody called Fred, three of us would turn around to answer. Anyway, my dad grew up in the Frankfurt area. And he hung with a large group that was called Dittman Athletic Association. And he played softball, football with that group. He worked at Curtis Publishing for 32 years. He was there from just about out of high school until Curtis closed their doors. My mom was kind of a stay-at-home mother, but in later years, she took a job working for what was then Food Fair Stores. Oh, my wife Ronnie.
Can't forget her.
Ronnie was, her real name was Veronica, but she never used that. So it was Ronnie her whole life, and still is. She was also a Frankfurt girl, and she only lived a few blocks away on Pratt Street. If you were friends with my wife, you had a friend forever. She went to St. Hubert's High School. She graduated on a Friday night, and on Monday morning, the next Monday morning, she went to work in town at Farm Journal magazine and stayed there for 13 years. Later on, after our son was grown and everything, she worked for the city as a crossing guard for 23 years at Pratt and Lord Street.
And what kind of work did you do?
Well, I originally started out, my only job in Frankford was that of a paper boy. I had a little job where I worked for a machine shop, but then I got laid off. And after that, I enlisted in the Air Force. I was away for 4 years in the Topeka, Kansas.
Now, the area where you grew up is part of Whitehall Commons. Can you tell us about its various parts?
Okay, I'll start off with the playground first. The playground was a hard-packed center field and did play some softball games over there, but the big thing was the bathhouse, which everybody called the Bathy.
Bathy.
Down at the other end down at the southern end of that was a baseball field. And I actually saw one time the Olney Cadets play the Kansas City Scars for, I'm pretty positive, it was a women's fast-pitch softball championship game. And the center section was referred to as Harding's Field because at the north end up by Wakeling Street was Harding Junior High School. Now, this was the most active section. Every night of the week, you could see softball games in an area large enough to house 3 separate fields. There was a man named George Ulmer who
Remember him?
was a fast-pitch softball pitcher for a team called Flatiron.
Underhand, right?
I saw him.
Yes, I saw him
this was
also.
an underhand pitch, an underhand fast pitch. One of the things I want to tell, because I'm not sure anybody would believe this, I was in elementary school at the time, and it was a bitter cold winter. And
What year are we talking about here? About.
In the early 50s, maybe
Okay.
late 40s.
Okay.
Anyway, all of a sudden on Dimon Street is this fire truck, a pumper. And it started spraying water all across Harding's Field, which was a hard-packed cinder field. And pretty soon there was a layer of ice. And the whole neighborhood got out there, and those who could skate were out there skating on it. You couldn't sled, it was too flat. But I don't think you'd ever see an action like that anywhere in the country at this time.
Great for the neighborhood.
And the western part was Dittman AA's football field, but that was all the way up at the north end, and it was caged in.
You mentioned something, Fred, when we spoke about a 5-mile train in Whitehall
okay.
Commons. What's that all about?
All right, it was probably just prior to everything going on in Korea, but we heard in the news that a train 5 miles long was going to stop at the Frankford Arsenal. So we're kids. So out my back gate, we sat on Harding's Field, and we could look across and see Pennsylvania Railroad's tracks. And here it started, and all of a sudden, here came 6 of Pennsylvania Railroad's large GG1 electric engines pulled into sight. We were amazed. We had seen these engines before, but not 6 of them. And then all of a sudden they started to pull out, and car after car, flatbeds, were loaded with jeeps and military trucks and field artillery. And then there would be boxcars that we assumed had ammunition. Now, I don't know if it was actually 5 miles long. We stopped counting after the 100th car, but that was the 5-mile train.
Would this be magic? One day having your love.
about some of the neighborhood schools in Frankfurt?
Up in the morning and out to school. The teacher is teaching the golden rule. American history and practical math. You study them hard and hoping to pass. Working your fingers right down to the bone. And the guy behind you won't leave you alone. Ring, ring goes the bell. The cook in the lunchroom's ready to sell. You're lucky if you can find a seat. You're fortunate if you have time to eat. Back in the classroom, open your books. Gee, but the teacher don't know how mean she looks. Soon as 3 o'clock rolls around.
What churches served the Frankfurt neighborhood?
Churches, there were all kinds of churches. We had plenty of places to go worship. I mean, there were Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, Christian Science, Friends. There was a synagogue. There was a New Jerusalem, Church of the New Jerusalem.
Fred, the pride of Frankfurt, and I remember this coming down to Frankfurt Avenue at times, was its shopping corridor from Bridge Street to the bend at Kensington Avenue. So let's talk about some of those neighborhood places in Frankfurt. What movie houses served the area?
Okay, there were actually, believe it or not, in this portion of the city, there were 6 movie houses. One of them was the Regal that was up on Oxford Avenue, and it was a small one, and I was only in there 1 or 2 times. But going back to Frankfurt Avenue, there were 5 along the avenue, and up towards Bridge Street was the Ellis, which I think at one time had been
The Forum.
the Forum Movies. So there was the Ellis, and then you got down, if you come south on Frankfurt Avenue, on the east side, was the Roosevelt. That's where all the teenagers like to go. And then you came down just not too many doors away was the Frankfurt. And then you keep going south. On the west side of Frankfurt Avenue was the Circle Theater.
That was a big one.
Ace Theater at the time was at Frankfurt Avenue, right where Kensington joins.
Yes.
But anyway, the 2 most ornate theaters was the Roosevelt and the Circle. The Roosevelt, of course, had a balcony. It was decorated in some kind of fancy style that I don't know. But it had box seats along both outer aisles. And this is where the teenagers liked, because they could go and make out in them box seats. The Circle was even more elaborate. And the thing that strikes me about that is, in the auditorium area along the walls were false walls, which means people could walk in and up and down and behind them. And when they would do, for instance, their Christmas shows, the music would be going on the stage or whatever, and people dressed in costumes maybe would jump out of hidden doors behind these false walls. The neat thing about Frankfurt Avenue shopping district is you didn't ever have to go any place to shop. Anything you wanted, you could buy on Frankfurt Avenue. Now, one of the more prominent ones was Schwartzman's Linens. Women came from all over to shop at Schwartzman's. They had fine linens and towels and curtains and things like that. It was all there.
You didn't need a car to shop.
You could walk. You could walk everywhere. And it was the place to be seen, believe it or not, on Friday night. Now, I mean, if you wanted to be seen, that was the place to go.
Who were the salesmen of the streets?
The milkman. He delivered to your house, and pretty much people had the same order every week. and the milkman delivered.
What dairies? Do you remember?
Oh, there was Harbison, there was Seal Test, there was Frankford Baldwin, which was a dairy right here in Frankfurt. We had what we called hucksters. So they were usually farmers that came with a truck, sometimes, a lot of times horse-drawn, and they open-sided, had usually some kind of an awning or canvas over top, and sold vegetables. And they would holler out watermelons or apples. There was a guy that came around, we called him the rag man because he would yell, "Any old rags, bottles, or bones today?" We never knew what the bones were, but there was a guy who came around and sharpened knives and scissors. The coal which heated most people's houses, got delivered to your street. But there were other ones that were, for instance, a guy came around with a camera and a pony. And the kids would hop on the pony and this man would take pictures. The strange one was the organ grinder. Now this was a man that would come around and he had what was called a barrel organ, usually on a strap around his neck, and it had a pole for him he would grind a crank that would play music, not soft like a music box, but on the same idea.
Did he have a monkey?
He usually had a monkey that held a tin cup.
That's what I remember from the movies.
And, we would put our pennies in, but it was kind of creepy because sometimes the monkey would grab your hand.
Ever bite you?
Never bit, but it was just a creepy feeling.
What about some of the popular restaurants? I can remember coming down Oxford on the 59 bus and seeing Verdi's.
Verdi's was the big one, and that was a kind of a family-oriented place to go. And they had good food. But let me tell you about Horn and Harditz. Horn and Harditz was an automat. Now, if you didn't know what that was, you walked in the building, there was a section with little glass doors that had food on them, sandwiches and desserts and things like that. And you would open the door and take out the food that you selected, and it would move on, and the next thing you know, there would be food again back in that little box. One of my favorite haunts was White Tower Hamburgers, because they had the best hamburgers in the world. I still say it today. There was the Oyster House. There was the Griscom House.
I remember that.
There was the Crab Net. There was the Italian Riviera.
How was Frankfurt served by public transportation?
Okay, well, we all know that the Frankfurt L, as we called it, started in Frankfurt up at Bridge Street and went all the way to 69th Street. Margaret Orthodox, which was a station a whole block long, and you could get off at Orthodox Street, off or on, and then off or on at Margaret Street. Then you had the 3 and the 5 trolleys, later became buses, that ran on Frankfurt Avenue. The 56 was at one of the streamlined trolleys that ran on Torresdale Avenue. And then you had buses like the J and the K, the 75. They kind of ran up and down the opposing streets.
We're here with Fred Prescott. And Fred, every neighborhood you wrote, especially in Frankfurt, had its share of unusual characters. Can you tell us about a few of them?
Yeah, I can still remember a lot of them. There was a guy that used to pass up and down our house on Margaret Street, and his name was Raker Flynn. At least that's what everybody called him. And he wore an Army overseas cap and an Army overcoat. And I saw my dad pass him $5 one time, and I asked him who this guy was. And he didn't know a whole lot about him except he was shell-shocked. Then there was 3 black guys we called the Booze Brothers.
The Booze Brothers?
Yeah, and we used to see them pretty much over in what we called the grass park. Most of the time, they were falling down drunk. Now, Even the cops had their own group of characters. The nicest one was a black cop named Officer White. And he was a foot patrolman that walked all through the neighborhoods. He was always smiling, he was always friendly. But then there were what we call the wise guy cops. One of them we called Wyatt Earp. Don't know his name, but he liked to pick on teenagers and did it quite often.
And you have a crazy story about the elephant. Share that with us.
Okay. I guess I was still around in elementary school when I heard the story. My grandmother told this story about a circus owner who lived in the house where Rose Funeral Parlor was. But he had a stable down by or at the spot where the fire station is. Now, supposedly, according to her story, one of his elephants died. And instead of him calling in somebody to take it away, he had his people bring it over and bury it in the front yard of the home where he was living. So there is information right here at the Historical Society that the stable was there, his home was there, but there's no record of the elephant getting buried.
How about your involvement with the Boy Scouts? That's something to be proud of.
Okay. I spent most of my entire life working with the Boy Scouts. I started out as a Cub Scout. My dad had been a Scout before me. He took me when I became of age to join Troop 108, which was sponsored by American Legion. I got hooked on scouting right away. It was kind of sad in the beginning when we first went there. There was no men's committee or anything, and the scoutmaster had taken off with the troop's funds. And there was an assistant scoutmaster who was trying to hold it together, and his name was Roy Shelfont. He was young. He was only 21 or 22 at the time, and he had diabetes. He took us on a camping trip one time, and it was one of those rainy, nasty weekends. My father tried to talk him into not going. He said the kids want to go. He took us. Short story, he came home, he got pneumonia and died.
That is tragic.
And the worst part was his brother was in the Air Force, was on his way home for the funeral. His plane disappeared and crashed it in the ocean. My dad got an adult committee together, and they sent us to the Jamboree in 1957 in Valley Forge. Over time, I took over as Scoutmaster in 1968 and spent the next 30 years as Scoutmaster. Some of the best times in my life in scouting. And there's nothing like, even today, I can sit in front of a campfire and just watch for hours. You don't even have to say anything.
You're the bedrock of Frankfurt, I must say. Something sad now, a real tragic event in Philadelphia history, the crash of the Congressional Limited. Way back wartime, 1943, really shocked the city and the neighborhood of Frankfurt.
I was only 2 years old at the time, but I can tell you in our family what happened. My mother was pregnant, so it was September 6, 1943.
Labor Day.
Word went out that there was a train wreck at Frankford Junction from a train going from Washington to, I think, New York.
Yes.
My grandfather got a call right away because he could weld. And sadly, that was to reach people who were trapped inside the cars. I believe there were over 70 that were killed.
About 80, I recall reading this.
And over 100 that were injured. Now, in the meantime, my grandfather had gone with the Model A down to where the wreck was. It's time for my mother to go to the hospital. So my dad took her in our 35 Chevy, and ran up to Frankford Hospital. And then when he got there were people, injured people, laying all over the lawns, and doctors and nurses out there doing whatever they had to do to protect those people. But as it turned out, our family doctor was a man named Dr. Charles Yetter. He got us a spot, got my mom a spot on a gurney in the hallway. But at least she got into the hospital, and my sister Pat was born there.
Quite a story. Let's conclude, Fred Prescott, with a really happy note. Rock and roll.
Okay.
King, absolute king in the 1950s.
I tell myself that I was present for the birth of rock and roll in Frankfurt. Now, I was about 13 years old when I was allowed to kind of hang out outside of the block that I lived on. So we used to hang out at this little luncheonette that had a jukebox. Now, there was nothing particular popular. There was a mix of country western, movie themes, some popular music. So there was nothing to be all thrilled about.
And what was the venue? Where did this happen?
That happened at this little jukebox in the store at Dittman and Orthodox Street, a place called John's. But Mary, his wife, was there more than John was. But swing was still, with the big band sound, was still the big popular music. Now, as I got a little older, we started hearing rumors about this new kind of music that was being pushed by a man named Alan Freed, and but we weren't hearing very much of it. Anyway, by 1955, more and more of this kind of music was kind of trickling in, but not very prominent. We heard there was a movie coming out about teenagers. Well, hell, we had to go see a movie about teenagers. We were teenagers.
Yes.
So we went to the early show, which most of the younger teenagers went to, and there was a movie going to play called Blackboard Jungle. And it really sounded to us like it was going to be about teenagers mentioning a blackboard. So we're sitting in the theater and the lights dim, and the previews were played, and then all of a sudden, Blackboard Jungle starts. And the first thing you hear is Bill Haley and his Comets playing Rock Around the Clock. And the theater went crazy.
This was the Roosevelt, right?
This is the Roosevelt Theater. The kids were jumping up and down and dancing in the aisles and screaming and hollering. I can remember popcorn boxes sailing across the room. And I guess the ushers were going crazy. They didn't know what to do or how to end it all. Anyway, what was really weird was the song was over and everybody sat down and watched the rest of the movie without any kind of incident. So I consider myself to be one of the first people to be here for the birth of rock and roll in Frankfurt.
Fred, we want to thank you very much for being with us. You certainly told us a lot about growing up in the neighborhood, the lost world of Frankfurt, I'll call it.
Yeah, and it really is much, much different than it used to be. To me, it was the pride of the city at one time, and of course, times have changed. But I still live here. I'm going to be here until the end, and I still love this part of the city of Philadelphia.